And thank you so much for being here this afternoon and joining us for our very, very timely debate on U.S. foreign policy challenges and opportunities. I'm Nancy Crystal Green, the Director of the Office of Public Policy Events. By facilitating discussion through group forums and debates, the Office of Public Policy Events aims to advance civil discourse and democratic principles. The University of Florida is rich with public policy scholars. I think all of us are here today looking forward to hear from two of those experts. I am deeply grateful to Dr. Jacobs and Dr. Inboden for their willingness to share their insights with us today. Our debate will be moderated, and you, the audience, will have the opportunity to interact with our speakers over cookies at the conclusion of our event. Also in the back, there are sign-ups for both the Graham Center and the Hamilton Center newsletters, so I encourage you to sign up on your way out this evening. Okay, so to begin, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Luca Carlson. Luca is a third-year political science student. He has been an Askew Scholar, a Hamilton Center Society of Fellows, a student leader in the Bob Graham Center, and he currently serves as the president of the Florida Student Policy Forum. Please help me in welcoming Luca Carlson.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Crystal Green, for the kind introduction. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion, but first I want to thank Dr. Crystal Green with the Office of Public Policy Events and Ashley Harden, Professor Marianne Vernetson with the Bob Graham Center, and Dr. James Hooks with the Hamilton Center, as well as the staff at both centers for making this event possible. Can we give them all a hand? All right. The title of our discussion today is U.S. Foreign Policy Today, Challenges and Opportunities. When I was asked to moderate this discussion, I said, can we all just pick something to talk about? I mean, U.S. foreign policy today, what's that supposed to mean? But when I introduce our speakers here in just one moment, you're going to understand why we couldn't limit our experts to just one topic. In addition to being two really good additions to any recreational basketball team, these are two tall guys. Our speakers are two fantastic historians. Dr. Matt Jacobs is director of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service. Dr. Jacobs received his PhD in history from UNC Chapel Hill. His first book was entitled Imagining the Middle East, the Building of an American Foreign Policy, and he's currently working on a second book, Placing Arab Spring in Historical Perspective. The International Studies major has doubled in enrollment under his leadership, and he works daily to add international perspective to the undergraduate experience. Please welcome Dr. Matt Jacobs. All right. Dr. William Inboden is director of the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education. He earned his PhD in history from Yale. He's a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations and author of 4 books on U.S. foreign policy. He previously directed the Clements Center for International Security at the University of Texas, Austin. In addition to his work as a scholar, he has served as a senior director for strategic planning on the National Security Council and an associate with the National Intelligence Council. Please welcome Dr. William Inboden.
Good to see you.
All right, take our seats. Thank you both for being here today. My hope is by discussing a number of issues at once, we'll be able to draw out some common threads in how our speakers reason through policy issues, relying on their understandings of the historical past and their ethical basis. But before we begin our discussion today, I wanted to ask a couple questions about how you each view civil discourse and civic health. I want to ask these questions because civic education is in the mission of both the Graham and Hamilton Centers, and because you guys approach it from varying perspectives. So I'll start with, we often hear about civic education as a solution to increasing polarization. Things would be better if everyone was smarter, we think. However, political scientists have observed that the people most engaged in politics are also the most polarized. With that in mind, how do we come to understand the role of civic education? The legislation that created the Office of Public Policy Events encourages debate. How do you suggest that we engage with those who disagree with us, not because they are unengaged, but because they hold different core values or perceptions of the truth? We'll start with Dr. Jacobs.
First, thanks everyone for being here, and thanks Luca for moderating, and thanks to Nancy for pulling this off on relatively short notice. I think it's really commendable to all of you for showing up as well to hear from Will and I on a variety of very complicated issues. The state of civil discourse and that kind of very sometimes touchy subject, but also I think very necessary subject. First of all, for me as director of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service, I argue that if we can't demonstrate civil discourse on a college campus, which is supposed to be an environment where there's a variety of ideas shared and critiqued and analyzed, if we can't demonstrate that on a college campus, we can't really expect our students to practice it once they get off campus, right? So for me, it's really critical that we model it, that behavior, that we provide opportunities for students to engage in civil discourse in the classroom and outside of the classroom, and that provides a foundation for a better society going forward. The question is, how do we actually do that? So the first thing I would say there is, inside the classroom, I think the state of civil discourse is a lot better than perhaps what people think. Now, partly that's because it's moderated. Outside the classroom, there's a much more performative component to it, which I think is a little more challenging. People trying to get something posted on social media, go viral, all of those kinds of things. I think that creates challenges. Let me use an example from the class I'm teaching this semester. Earlier this semester, we were discussing whether or not it was appropriate to drop atomic weapons on Japan at the end of World War II. And I asked for a quick show of hands at the start of class. How many of you think it was a good idea or appropriate? A few hands went up. Then I said, okay, how many of you think it was inappropriate? A few more hands went up. But combined, there was less than half the class that raised their hand. So I said, okay, so there's two possible explanations for the rest of you. Either you're agnostic or you don't feel like you know enough to have an informed opinion, or you're scared to say something. So let's talk through that, right? So we had a really good discussion that ended that class and carried forward to the next day in class. And afterwards, I told them, look, you guys just set the standard for what civil discourse in this classroom should be. They did an awesome job with it. And they're discussing something that had real life implications for literally thousands and thousands of people. If you can do that in a classroom, you should be able to talk about your family politics without getting in fistfights over the Thanksgiving table as well, right? So I think it starts in the classroom, and that's really important.
Dr. Inboden, your perspective?
Sure. So thank you very much, Luca, and I'll echo Matt's thanks to Nancy and her team. And as a relative newcomer to Gainesville and UF, it is wonderful to be here after 13 years in Texas. I worry I'm getting the event off to a bad start, since Nancy told me I'm supposed to disagree with Matt, but I actually have to agree with everything he just said. So time for punch and cookies, right? Okay. So instead, I will just affirm everything Matt said on civil discourse, and I will kind of address the other half of Luca's question about civic education. And I think civil discourse is a natural product and outgrowth, a fruit of civic education. So I want to offer a couple of reflections on the civic education part. It's one of these amorphous terms that's kind of everywhere but nowhere, and we all kind of think it's a good thing, but we don't really know what it means. So let me try to give a little bit of texture to that. I think the two components of civic education that certainly the Hamilton Center's academic mission are focused on, and I know Bob Graham shares a lot of this, are what it means to be human and what it means to be an American, right? And so on the human part, this comes with appreciating that our fellow human beings are our fellow human beings, right? That they are not first primarily an adversary or an enemy or a holder of wrong ideas, but they are a fellow human being whose dignity and worth as a human being inheres in them by virtue of their creation and their existence. And we have obligations then to respect them, even to love them. It doesn't mean we have obligations to agree with them, of course, and sometimes as we'll talk about in some of the conflict situations, we may find ourselves in an adversarial role. But first, that beginning default is understanding our fellow human beings as our fellow human beings rather than some enemy or troll on social media. And then second, what does it mean to be an American, right? And most of the students and faculty here at the university are Americans. Not all are, but we are an American university in the United States. And so what does civic education mean there? Well, I think it starts with understanding the United States as primarily an idea. And to be an American citizen is to affirm and subscribe to a set of ideas. And this is why American citizenship is not bound by race or ethnicity or religion. And it's very unique in the American founding. We are the first nation state in the world founded on a creed, a set of ideas. And let's start with our First Amendment, right? The 5 freedoms promised and codified in the First Amendment: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and then finally the right, the freedom to petition our government for redress of grievances. I think those are a bundled set of goods, and if we embrace them, they will make us better citizens. They will improve our civil discourse. If we understand that all of these together work to create both certainly a body of rights, but also obligations we have to our fellow citizens. What's that mean practically? It means that we can agree to disagree with civility, that we will respect the right of others and even welcome them to bring forward views that we may not just disagree with about, do you prefer chicken or steak or Coke or Pepsi, but what do you think about really important foundational issues, about the nature of life, of existence, of some of the very charged political issues that we face. If we can start with a reaffirmation and understanding of those foundational freedoms in the First Amendment, I think that is the beginning of wisdom for a broader civic education and improving our civil discourse.
All right, we've just touched on an area that both of your centers share, civic education. I'm often asked, though, by fellow students, how are the two centers different? So I'm going to give you the opportunity now to delineate some things that make your center special and that are characteristic of its approach to education. I think it might be a helpful point of departure to think about the namesakes of your centers and go from there. So, Dr. Inboden, what does it mean to be the Hamilton Center, and maybe what kind of programming is available for students who want to get involved?
Thank you. Yeah. So our full name is the Alexander Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education, and I'll have a couple reflections on Mr. Hamilton's life and career there in a second. But I first actually want to pay tribute to the Bob Graham Center and its namesake. I spent the first half of my career for about 15 years in Washington, D.C. and overseas working as a foreign policy maker. As part of the time, had the honor of working in the U.S. Senate as a staff member and working with Senator Graham. I was in a different office at the time, but we worked closely with his office on some Cuba policy and a few other issues. And then as now, he was just a great statesman, known for civility, for studying the issues carefully, for serious legislating rather than just posturing. And for a real commitment to the good of Florida and to the United States. And so it's an honor for me to now be on a campus where he and his legacy are honored and even be sharing a stage there. But you asked about Alexander Hamilton. For those of you who have not seen the great musical or movie or read the great biography, I think Alexander Hamilton's life embodies so much of our mission, right? So it's a remarkable story. It's a great, distinctively American story. Right? He's born in poverty in the West Indies to a single mother, raised in destitution. And yet, as a teenager, is able to emigrate to what becomes the United States. At the time, the British colonies, and through the combination of the promise and resources in this new nation, which he helps form, but also especially his education at King's College in New York, now Columbia University, he's able to experience a tremendous upward mobility, become quite literally one of the founding fathers of our country, and for him, a lot of that is steeped in his education. He was educated in the great classics of Western civilization, which they were teaching there at King's College in the 18th century, and still continues in some form at Columbia. It should be acknowledged. And from that becomes a great war hero in the Revolutionary War, becomes a great advisor to General Washington and then President Washington, our first president, the first Treasury Secretary, and really helps to form so many of the institutions of the country that we still live in now and the system of government we live in now. And so those themes, drawing on the best riches of Western civilization, of classical education, and character formation, those shape what we are trying to do now with the Hamilton Center. We're very new. We're still in the process of hiring faculty, rolling out some classes. We'll be offering about 25 classes this spring, so you can look forward to some of those, and eventually some new majors and degrees as well.
Dr. J, what does it mean to be the Bob Graham Center?
Sure, thanks. And thanks for the kind words about former Governor and Senator Graham. Before I answer the question specifically or directly, I also want to go back to one point about civil discourse. One of the things I think that the problems that we have in society today is that everything's presented as binaries, right? So that the assumption is that there's always your interlocutor is somebody who holds the diametrically opposed point of view to what you hold. And that's actually very rarely the case, right? So one of the things as we get into the conversation here in a few minutes that you're going to recognize very quickly is that this is about embracing complexity. Any of the issues that we're about to talk about, if they were simple, we wouldn't be talking about them. They would have been solved long ago, right? So we have to acknowledge and embrace the complexity. And I think that's a critical piece to thinking about civil discourse, is not looking for the direct binaries, but looking for the complexity. About the Graham Center, so it is founded for and named after former Florida Senator and Governor Bob Graham. Bob founded the center in 2006 to focus on civic engagement, public service, public leadership, and effective public policy development and implementation. And he really firmly believes in the concept of learning by doing, right? So we have a variety of different initiatives, from academic programs, the international studies major, public leadership minor. We do a lot of professional development, so we have internship programs in Tallahassee, DC, Gainesville, with some nonprofits and so on. Other types of career professional development talks, public programming. We have historically been the primary facilitator of U.S. voter engagement initiatives. You might not realize this, but the 1965 Higher Education Act mandates that all institutions of higher education receiving federal funding must take all reasonable measures to provide students with voter engagement information, registration information, voter turnout information. We have historically been tasked with making sure that UF meets those responsibilities. We work with 6 different student orgs and initiatives on campus as well. So obviously we have the benefit of having been around for 17 years, so we've had the chance to build out some of these kinds of things. I think one of the advantages the Hamilton Center has right now is resources. So a $10 million recurring budget helps a lot in that regard. And so that's a space where they're going to have to...
We're paying for happy hour tonight.
But they're going to have to grow and do things pretty quickly, right? And so that's going to be a challenge for them. And the Graham Center has the luxury in that context of having an established reputation on campus. The last thing I'll say is that we are nonpartisan. I do not think it would be very good for this campus or for either of our centers if students start viewing the Hamilton Center as the place to go because they're of one political background, and the Graham Center is a place to go if you're of a different political background. We will have spaces where our interests intersect. Civic engagement is one of those. Civil discourse is one of those. But we'll also have spaces where our interests are different, and we will do our own things. This is, I think, an early indication of our opportunities and potential for some partnership on things. But make no mistake, we're different entities who do different things, and that will continue. And I look forward to the opportunities for interaction and intersection, but I also look forward to the opportunities to be who we are as independent entities too.
All right, we're going to move into the foreign policy portion of our discussion today. We're going to start our conversation back in 2001. In the wake of 9/11, the U.S. moved to oust the Taliban from power on the grounds that they were providing a safe haven for al-Qaeda. In 2021, the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan after a 20-year war in which well over 100,000 died, including some 7,000 Americans. At the same time, al-Qaeda's presence in the region has been reduced. So, Professor Inboden, I'm going to start with you. Was America's war in Afghanistan over the last 20 years a success or failure? Was President Biden right to withdraw all U.S. forces? And maybe more generally, thinking historically, has war been effective as a mode of combating terrorism?
Okay, all right, there's a lot there. I'll try to address that briefly. Before I do, though, this is, since we're now getting into the policy debate discussion form of the event, I should stress that the views I'm going to share on American foreign policy, and I do have views, you'll hear them in a moment, they're mine personally. So I'm not, I was speaking for the Hamilton Center earlier when I talk about our namesake and our mission. My Hamilton colleagues here would hopefully endorse all that. But now I'm not speaking for the Hamilton Center. We don't take positions on foreign policy issues. I'm just speaking as a concerned citizen, right? So, okay. And I'm sure some of my Hamilton colleagues will probably disagree with quite a bit of what I have to say, but that's what makes life interesting. Your question there, Luca, was our intervention in Afghanistan after 9/11 a success or a failure, and was President Biden to do the withdrawal? I think that our Afghanistan intervention was a success in part and a failure in part on two different questions, and there were two different goals. And here I will speak somewhat autobiographically. I was in Washington, D.C. on September 11th. I had passed 100 yards from the Pentagon an hour before it got hit as I was doing my morning commute. And I recall that time, since I know for the students in here, this is the distant past. A lot of you were born after these events. But for those of my generation or the generation that experienced 9/11, it was, very, very searing, right? It's one of those things that will stay with you the rest of your life. And in my second phase of life as a scholar, go back and try to evaluate historically and critically American foreign policy, I always begin with the first principle of some effort at empathy for what did the world look like at the time to America's leaders and the decisions they were making, and what did it feel like at the time. And so I begin with recapturing that. For weeks afterward in Washington, D.C., every morning when I'd go into the office, I was in the process of joining the State Department, working in the Bush administration, I'd pass by the Pentagon. And for weeks afterward, there was a 1,000-foot-high black pillar of smoke coming out of it, right? And so it was a daily reminder of what had happened. Also, every day and every night in Washington and New York as well for months afterwards, we weren't asking ourselves or wondering if we're going to get hit again. We were asking ourselves and wondering when will we get hit again. It was just the widespread assumption this will happen because we knew Al-Qaeda had just visited this awful destruction on us and that they had the capability and intent to do it again. And so that was the mentality at the time. And so there was a major strategic shift for the Bush administration, and it was bipartisan. All of the Democrats in Congress supported this of we can't just play defense anymore. We can't wait to get hit again. We have to go on offense. What does that mean? It means we need to destroy as much of Al-Qaeda as we can, and we need to destroy any safe havens that they are taking advantage of, primarily the safe haven of Afghanistan provided by the Taliban. And so why the American invasion of Afghanistan, I would say, was in part a success. It's because here we are 22 years later, and we haven't been hit again in a large-scale way. And there was just the assumption for months, years afterwards that we would. So that is the ultimate measure of success. However, it's also in part a failure, because there was a second goal eventually of American foreign policy in Afghanistan, one which Bush created and then Obama continued. And that was to leave Afghanistan as a reasonably stable, secure, self-governing place that doesn't harbor and sponsor terrorism, right? And that's why there was so much expense of American and NATO blood and treasure there, and the deaths of so many Afghan lives who paid, who suffered the most from this. And the fact that Afghanistan is now yet again governed by the Taliban, and the Taliban has not relinquished their support for terrorism. Now they're dealing with some internecine fights with ISIS right now. By that measure, I think the intervention, we can't say it succeeded. Finally, on President Biden's decision to withdraw, this is, I think, a good case study in the challenges of foreign policy making. And too often, I think, for Americans especially, we're all innately idealist, even if we won't admit it to ourselves. When we look at the world of foreign policy challenges, we think, all right, I either want to fix it or I want to go away, right? It's a binary. We either want to fix that problem and make the world better, or we just want to leave it alone. And most foreign policy, the work of most statecraft, is managing problems. It's not solving them, but it's also not walking away from them. I think that by 2019, 2020, we had gotten to the place where Afghanistan was not going to be stable and secure, but it was also not a robust terrorist safe haven. I think it was a problem to be managed. And in the last couple of years there wasn't a single American combat death, right? It was not costing us a lot of money and blood and treasure. And we had finally, after much trial and error and exorbitant cost and terrible mistakes, found a reasonable equilibrium of you leave behind about 4,000 or 5,000 American troops there to do train and equip and support missions, and the Afghans provide for their own security, and it kind of keeps the government together. It was terribly unsatisfying. It's not a success, but it's not a disaster either. And I think the withdrawal showed that it could become a disaster, and that's what it became. So I'm critical of the way the withdrawal was done.
Dr. Jacobs.
Sure. With continuing the autobiographical piece, on 9/11, I was actually teaching here at UF, my first real class. It was Muslim world from 1500 to the present. It was a Tuesday, Thursday class, double period on Tuesday, started at 8:30. I was in class when 9/11 happened, and that day's topic was different meanings of the word jihad through Muslim history. So that was literally what I was teaching as 9/11 was happening. I walked out of the classroom to a very different world where the very topic we had just been discussing had assumed enormous relevance, right? So my entire career, and I'm a specialist in U.S. Middle East relations, has been defined in part by 9/11, as has yours in some ways. To the question of was it a success? No war that lasts 20 years is a success. It just isn't, right? If it were a success overall, it wouldn't have lasted 20 years. But we have to break that down a little bit. If the objective, and this was an objective, was to disrupt Al-Qaeda, to not get hit again, as Will said, in that narrow context, it was successful, at least in the relative short term. If a second objective was to get bin Laden, it took 10 years, but that also can be counted at least as a partial success. The fact it took 10 years and all, we could discuss that. Other than that, though, it's hard to define that as a success. And I think part of the problem actually goes back to the start. And first of all, any president, if they were going to survive politically, had to respond to 9/11. And there's an interesting hypothetical to think through, well, what if Gore had been president? Not a far-fetched thing to try to imagine given the 2000 election. What a lot of people don't realize is that in 1998, President Clinton tasked Vice President Gore with reimagining U.S. military planning for Afghanistan. So even had Gore been president, he almost certainly would have engaged in a military operation in Afghanistan. Iraq might be a different story, but Afghanistan, I think, would have played out at least in the early phases in some similar ways. Again, we could dispute or argue over, would CIA, defense, some of those internal conflicts have happened the way they did or not. But the larger issue, I think, is if you go back to President Bush's speech following 9/11 to Congress, where he laid out his vision for a post-9/11 world, and much of that vision makes sense, but he talks about how a lot of this is going to happen behind the scenes, away from public eye. The funding is actually kept off book for the most part in the early years. The implementation or use of private security contractors at a number almost equal to U.S. military, active duty U.S. military forces or reserve military forces in country. Processing the war that way, the effort to try, and I'm actually not being explicitly critical of Bush, I think that this was a national security approach to the problem. Doing it that way meant that when that comes to an end, when the effort has been to try to hide it from public view for 20 years, when that comes to an end, that's going to be messy. And it's complicated by the end of Vietnam. And many of you will have seen the famous photo from 1975, April 30th, 1975, with the evacuation of Vietnamese citizens off from the roof of the American embassy. It's a famous photo. Members of the media were looking for that equivalent photo from Afghanistan too. You can see if you go and you look at popular photos from the withdrawal, you can see them trying to recreate that in the imagery that they had available to them. You can see the angles they're trying to take, that they're also trying to play into that draw that parallel relationship there. So I think the question of success in short term, in narrow ways, you could say that. But again, no war that lasts 20 years can be defined as a success. On the withdrawal itself, could it have been handled differently? Yes, it could have been handled differently, but we're down to 2,500 troops in country at that point, and the Taliban had made it clear that there would be no further progress on other issues if U.S. troops remained in country. And that drawdown date in various forms had been on the table for a couple years at that point, too. So it wasn't an out of the blue. Could the Biden administration have dealt with it better? Yes. But I think ultimately at that point, the outcome was pretty clear.
All right, Professor Inboden, I want to give you a chance to respond to some of those things, but I'm also going to ask our next question at the same time. What should our foreign policy in Afghanistan look like going forward? State Department officials have met with the Taliban, and they remain formally unrecognized. Should the U.S. recognize the Taliban?
Yeah, I don't think the U.S. should recognize the Taliban, certainly until we see dramatic reforms on their parts. We're in a tough spot right now because there's evidence that Al-Qaeda is at least partially reconstituting itself there. We had a great success in taking out their leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, shortly after the withdrawal. But one underappreciated advantage to having at least some troop presence in places, it also gives you intelligence collection capabilities, right? And now that we have no American presence there, we have no CIA assets there, we have none of our defense intelligence assets, and so we're only relying really just on electronic monitoring, and it's just a lot harder to know what the potential terrorists are up to, especially with them being sheltered by the Taliban. So I think diplomatic engagement would just give the Taliban legitimacy that they don't deserve. I think it would be a betrayal to the millions and millions of Afghan women who are now being put back into quite literal slavery, not even allowed to have an education or appear in public in so many cases. And it would also cause friction with an important emerging strategic partner in India, who's very unhappy with how we have left such a big problem of Afghanistan festering in their backyard.
Dr. Jacobs?
Yeah, that's actually a really difficult question, right? For some of the reasons Will mentions in terms of obviously what's going on with the domestic population in Afghanistan. I do differ some. I don't believe that we should normalize relations with the Taliban, but we have been engaging with the Taliban in other ways for several years. We've negotiated with them at different points in time. So I think part of what we're talking about here is a formality because we do engage with them. It's not that we ignore them or pretend they don't exist. So then the question is, what does that look like in real terms, in practical terms, right? And Will is also correct in terms of the problem with absence of intelligence capabilities and some of those things, especially as it comes to Al-Qaeda. But I would argue for a little bit more engagement with the Taliban, recognizing some of those limitations and concerns that Will express is one of the topics we're going to talk about in a little bit. I'll talk about some of the challenges of not doing that and where we end up as well. So I'll save those remarks for that.
All right. As we talk about terrorism, Israel recently suffered an attack at the hands of Hamas, which the U.S. has designated as a terrorist group. President Biden is asking Congress for further military aid to Israel. There is concern that the conflict could grow into a larger war in the region as Iran and other nations may be drawn in. And at the same time, we've seen the civilian toll in Gaza growing. The U.S. vetoed a UN Security Council resolution calling for humanitarian pauses to the conflict. Is this the right move? Should the U.S. be supporting policy of de-escalation or not? Dr. Jacobs, we'll start with you.
So obviously, again, a horrible set of circumstances going on as we speak and has been going on for now the last 10 to 12 days. First of all, Hamas bears responsibility for what Hamas did. No one else bears responsibility for that, and it was a horrific attack. I think the numbers game gets a little problematic for a variety of reasons. So some of you may have heard there's over 1,400 Israelis died in the initial attack. That's horrible. That would be the equivalent of about 50,000 Americans on 9/11. Over 5,700 Palestinians have died since the retaliatory strikes and attacks have begun. Amongst the Palestinian population, that'd be the equivalent of 940,000 in the West Bank dying. Those kinds of numbers, there's nothing that you can talk about in terms of proportionality. And I'm not talking about proportionality between Israelis and Palestinians. I'm talking about the whole conversation of, oh, well, that would be this many on this attack, this many on that attack, because it takes you into a totally different world that gets you focused on statistics and data and numbers as opposed to the humanity of the problem, right? Regarding the specific policy question, Israel has the right, could, should respond, right? That was a horrific attack. At the same time, I'm not a fan, for a whole range of reasons, of discussions that focus the conversation on evil, on irrationality, because what that does is remove the responsibility of actually trying to understand what's going on. If we can just say, oh, this was evil, or oh, this is totally irrational, then we have no expectation, no responsibility, no possibility of actually trying to understand the dynamics of the problem. That doesn't mean absolving one group of responsibility for what they've done. It doesn't mean saying that that somebody else is responsible for it. None of that. The other piece in terms of the U.S. approach here that I would say is that the U.S. response should be supportive of Israel in specific ways, and it should be strong support in specific ways. But I don't think it should be unconditional, because unconditionality is going to further lead to circumstances that will make it harder to solve or address the problem down the line. So unconditionality would mean continuing to allow the settlements to go in the West Bank. Unconditionality would say, look, you do whatever you need to do, and we won't worry about the consequences of that over the longer term. So I would support specific U.S. support for Israel that can include intelligence support, can include providing some weapon support and some things, as long as those are being targeted in very particular ways. Again, Israel has a right to respond and to defend itself in this circumstance, but that needs to be done in a way that is ideally not making the problem worse over the long term, because that's not going to be in anybody's interest. It's not going to be in Israel's interest. It's not going to be in the Palestinians' interest. It's not going to be in the United States' interest or anyone else's interest over the long term if that is the basic approach.
Professor Inboden.
Yeah, I'm going to use some strong words here in a moment, but I want to give you the preface that I think to think clearly, both in analytical and policy and moral terms, about the dreadful situation there in Israel and the Gaza Strip, we need to disaggregate Hamas from the plight of the Palestinian people, all right, and their hopes for statehood and the suffering they've endured. Hamas is the moral equivalent of a neo-Nazi group, okay? They are not dedicated to a Palestinian state. They are not dedicated to improving the lives of the Palestinian people. They are dedicated to killing as many Jews as possible. Literally, read their charter, okay? And no one, Hamas is responsible for most of the suffering that the Palestinians have been enduring in Gaza, right? I mean, Hamas has killed so many Palestinians there. That's why they want to allow free and fair elections. That's why they rule with an iron fist. That's why they use the Palestinian people as human shields, okay? So part of Hamas's strategy in trying to win the broader media and information war against Israel is to cause as many Palestinian civilian deaths as possible. And if we understand that, then I think Israel's goal, which I strongly support, of destroying Hamas is a lot more understandable and defensible, and does not include wreaking havoc or violence on the Palestinian people. Because of Hamas's strategy of using Palestinian civilians as human shields, inevitably there will continue to be more Palestinian civilian suffering and deaths, and that is horrible. But the solution to that is not to give Hamas free rein to try to kill as many Jews as possible, which is what they did on October 7th and what their goal continues to be. And so this is why, yes, I'm very supportive of the military and intelligence and all the operations that Israel is undertaking. Now, I also hope that the United States will, in partnering closely with Israel and supporting Israel, be also a voice of caution and prudence in other ways too. So this does not mean necessarily a full endorsement of whatever policies Israel will be following through here. And we still don't quite know, right? There will be some sort of ground invasion, but it hasn't happened yet. We're not sure what it's going to look like. Because there are major escalatory concerns in the region, right? Hezbollah to Israel's north, occupying southern Lebanon, being an Iranian proxy. They pose a very mortal threat to Israel. Iran itself has also sworn to Israel's destruction. Any opening of a second front or an Israel-Iran war would almost certainly drag the United States in. We don't want that. Israel doesn't want that. Iran doesn't want that. And so I certainly share the goal of containing this conflict to Israel and Hamas. And I'm strongly endorsing Israel's victory there as quickly as possible. And then some sort of fresh start can be undertaken to give the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank prospects of a better life. And that's going to be a very hard path forward. It's a very difficult situation. But I think we, go back to that original point, we need to disaggregate the evil of Hamas, like I said, the moral equivalent of neo-Nazis, from the plight of the Palestinian people.
These are difficult and complex issues. And we might be able to identify, as we look at sort of a profile of terrorists globally, whether white supremacists in the US or Islamic extremists in Afghanistan, of terrorists as disgruntled young men generally. To me, this suggests that there are some common characteristics of extremism and the folks it psychologically appeals to, wherever it's found. If we wish to combat terrorism proactively, how might we prevent extremist groups from developing and recruiting successfully? Professor Inboden, start with you.
So, Luca, I won't dodge the question. I'll say I've spent the better part of 20 years thinking about studying this, working on it, okay? So it's really difficult. I don't know. And that's not for lack of trying. About 18 months after 9/11, when I was working with in the State Department, then the National Security Council in the Bush administration, we had some pretty significant initial successes in our counterterrorism. By then, we had killed or captured most of the al-Qaeda leadership, with the big exception, of course, of bin Laden and Zawahiri, and that took a decade or two afterwards. But had severely degraded al-Qaeda's capability to visit violence on the United States. But then we were seeing a problem. For every one of these terrorists that we as the United States killed or captured, more were being created, more were popping up. And so we then sifted, while still continuing some of those aggressive kinetic and other type operations using force, started thinking about, okay, so how do we address this root cause problem, right? How do we prevent new generations of terrorists from being created? To oversimplify, and this also applies to the white supremacy challenge that you mentioned earlier, Luca, which unfortunately has returned in some really vicious ways now. There do seem to be two common ingredients in radicalization, and it's usually, but not always, young men, but usually is. It's not poverty, right? Sometimes they're impoverished, but most of the 9/11 hijackers had college degrees. 15 of the 19 were from Saudi Arabia, one of the wealthiest per capita nations in the world, right? So it's not poverty, but it seems to be a combination of two things. One, a grievance, a sense of grievance, some sort of sense of the world is unfair to me and my people group, however I identify that. The world is unfair, is unjust. And then some sort of meta-narrative ideology that provides answers. It says, the reason that you are suffering that injustice is these people or this cause over here, and therefore you need to take up arms or do any other dramatic measures against that. And so it's there are not easy answers. Like I said, I've studied and thought about this a lot, and we haven't been able to find them, but whatever solutions there are need to address those two things. It needs to be at least being mindful and understanding those grievances. And a lot of times the grievances, sometimes they may be semi-legitimate, other times they are wildly illegitimate, right? But we at least understand that there's a deep grievance here. And then the other part is, what is the ideology that's trying to provide an answer? So violent jihadism is saying, all right, well, take up arms, even kill yourself in murdering as many Christians, Jews, Americans, whatever as possible, and then that will usher usher in the glorious caliphate and then eternal rewards. So there also needs to be, or white supremacy, right? So, okay, the grievance is all those non-white people out there are ruining your life or ruining, whatever country you care about, and therefore the answer is, killing or wreaking violence or discriminating against non-white people and restoring white people to their deserved primacy. So one also needs to address those ideologies and point out, okay, here's what is wrong about that. Here's why that won't answer your problems, your grievances. Here's why that will eventually be a dead end. Some of that sometimes just involves demonstrating the humanity of the people that you're actually hating, and that can be, it sounds nice, but also a little ethereal. But that is one recipe we sometimes found was successful in some counter-radicalization, was close encounters and building real friendships with the people that you were sworn to hate. There was a white supremacist, a recovering white supremacist I knew in Washington, D.C. years ago. He had been sent to prison for 10 years for trying to set off a bomb in a predominantly black church in Alabama back in the 1970s. And during those 10 years in prison, two things happened to him. One, he became a Christian, so he repented of his sins and trusted in Jesus Christ. And two, he became friends with his black cellmate and realized, wow, this is my fellow human being. Now, I won't mention the names to protect privacy, but they are still close friends to this day. And so it was kind of detoxifying that ideology and realizing that the person you hate and are dehumanizing is actually your fellow human being.
Professor Jacobs.
Yeah, so countering extremism is, again, a really difficult problem and really, really challenging. And I would frame it, the potential approaches a little differently. So is counterterrorism a military problem? Perhaps on a large scale. It was, after 9/11. Is counterterrorism a kind of a law issue, a kind of a criminal justice issue? Maybe when you're talking about smaller groups or something like that. Is counterterrorism a political engagement issue? Maybe in some cases. Is it an economics issue, that if you can get people off the streets into productive jobs and through education systems, it may be. What that shows you is that the problem is really, really complicated, right? There's a lot of different pieces to it. And what further complicates it in terms of the issue of terrorism itself is that governments have to be right 100% of the time, right? Terrorists have to be right once to accomplish whatever it is they're trying to accomplish. Without being too blunt about it, what that really means is that we as citizens, as society, also have to play a role in defining what we believe to be an acceptable level of risk. Right? And that sounds kind of cold and such to think of it in those terms, but we have to recognize that what counterterrorism boils down to is defining procedures to pursue it relative to acceptable levels of risk relative to whatever the target potential extremist population that you're trying to pursue counterterrorism or counter-extremism initiatives in. And that's really, really complex, right? So you have to balance those three things in that process. Now, you also have to balance in that what sorts of measures as a society do we think are appropriate to take. So I'll use two from different administrations. So I'm maintaining my nonpartisanship here in terms of director of the Graham Center. There was a phone call that Condoleezza Rice got when she was in the Bush administration where it came from Guantanamo Bay, where they had, she got the call that they had just waterboarded an individual for the 100th time. Think about that for a second. What information do you think you're going to get after number 100 that you didn't get after the previous 99? Right? Now I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, right? Now, take the other example. During the Obama administration, Anwar al-Awlaki, who is a U.S. citizen, was in Yemen. He was there trying to develop plans to attack the United States and U.S. citizens. But again, remember, he's a U.S. citizen. So the Obama administration takes him out with a drone strike while he's in Yemen. Now, again, he's a U.S. citizen. When did he forfeit his rights as a U.S. citizen? Some would argue, and this is a reasonable discussion to have, that once he started trying to develop plans to attack other U.S. citizens, maybe he forfeited his rights as a U.S. citizen. but there's no discussion of that in terms of broader society. Did you or I have any role in deciding, okay, well, this is where people are forfeiting their rights as U.S. citizens and therefore eligible to be taken out by some, power that decides that now's the time, right? So I use those two examples, both individuals who had engaged in activities against the United States, to highlight just how complicated this is and how we have to play a role in society in trying to determine what we think acceptable risk is, what we think appropriate procedures are, understanding that we don't have all the information. We don't have the intelligence information that others might have, and so on. But I also would suggest that overstretching and overreaching in responses to various attacks and challenges also doesn't help in some instances, right? We have a right to deal with those, to try to address the immediate challenge that we see, but we have to do so smartly and in ways that recognize the challenges there.
All right. Dr. Inboden, we just discussed Iran's opposition of Israel. Let's talk about the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, colloquially known as the Iran nuclear deal. This deal restricted Iran's supply of enriched uranium used in weapons in exchange for relief from U.S. sanctions from the U.S., EU, and UN. The deal was made by President Obama, and President Trump pulled out of it, calling it one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the U.S. has ever entered. One argument Trump made was that relief from sanctions enabled Iran to fund Hamas and Hezbollah. I'm curious, who is right? Was the deal good or bad?
Yeah, it was a bad deal at the time, and it continues to be a bad deal. So I opposed it then, and I continue to oppose it. I'm glad that President Trump pulled out of it. Why is that? Excuse me. First, a little bit of context here. Every U.S. president from Ronald Reagan forward, right? Reagan, Bush 41, Clinton, Bush 43, Obama, tried to engage in outreach to Iran, tried to reduce the American tension and hostility with Iran, and tried to bring Iran in from the cold, right? Build a constructive relationship. And every time they failed. Why? Because the Iranian revolutionary regime, right? The government of Iran, which is really this revolutionary terrorist sponsoring movement, they define themselves by their opposition to the United States. Okay, so they define the United States as their great enemy, and as they have impoverished and oppressed their people at home, they've losing sources of legitimacy, and so they need the United States as an enemy. And so when the United States tries to do something conciliatory, they won't reciprocate. Second is the Iranian regime sees acquiring a nuclear weapon as not just a key for its own security and preserving its hold on power, but also a key to its power projection in the region. Especially, they think it'll give them more free rein to support Hamas, to support Hezbollah, for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, essentially their terrorist militia, to kill Americans. They killed hundreds of Americans in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere. And so, why was the nuclear deal a bad idea? Well, just on, I think it fails on its own terms, right? So it's predicated on the United States and our European allies giving Iran billions of dollars in sanctions relief, and a hope that Iran would use that to provide for the welfare of its people rather than fund more terrorism. Well, of course, they just used it to fund more terrorism, and their people are still impoverished. It was also predicated on the hope that Iran would allow open access to its nuclear sites so that UN inspectors under the IAEA could go inspect them. Well, the terms of the deal said we had to give 30 days notice before even inspecting. That's plenty of time to clean up a nuclear site, and that's exactly what they did. So we couldn't even verify it. And we know now that they were cheating on the deal. Finally, there was a strategic contradiction at the heart of the deal. Notice that it wasn't a deal in perpetuity. It was done with a 10-year sunset. And the Obama administration, I know this from friends who served in it, I would talk to and argue with about the deal. The quiet part that they couldn't say out loud was that they hoped that by having Iran slow down its nuclear weapons program, its enrichment program, over the 10-year term of the deal, that in that 10-year time, the Iranian people would kind of rise up and overthrow their government, and you'd have some sort of peaceful regime change. So they thought the regime had a 10-year time horizon. May it be thus, it doesn't seem that that's happening. The contradiction is this: if that is the hope of the deal, that it's only limited for 10 years because you're hoping that government will go away at that time, then you don't prolong that government's life and power by unfreezing about $20 billion in assets, which is exactly what has continued that regime. And so that's why I think that it was a bad deal. It made the region and the United States and our allies less secure.
Dr. Jacobs.
Yeah, so I don't think it was a good deal, but I think it was the least bad option available at the moment. So to think through this again in a slightly different way, let's ask ourselves a couple of different questions. One is, why do countries pursue nuclear weapons? One reason is they plan to use them on someone. We hope that isn't the case, but hope is not a policy. And as somebody who was an Obama supporter, I hope for a lot of things, but hope is not a policy, right? So start with that. Second reason is deterrence, and that's part of what Will was talking about in terms of believing that that would give them a greater power projection and all of that, because it gave them a deterrent factor. And then the third was the countries want a seat at the table. Which table might be open to question and discussion, right? But they want the credibility, the recognition that comes with that. The second and third option you can deal with in a variety of different ways, the deterrence factor and the credibility factor. As I said, hope is not a policy, though, in terms of hoping that a country who has nukes won't use them simply because they want to use them on another country. So you have to find a way to try to address that. Then you have to think through, well, what are the alternative ways to try to do that? So we had been pursuing a variety of policies. Will's right, every administration had reached out. Reagan administration had actually sold arms to the Iranian revolutionary government in the 80s. The Reagan, Clinton, and Bush administration, the State Departments in each of those, had actually filed amicus briefs in U.S. courts in support of the Iranian government when families of former hostages from the Iran hostage crisis from 1979 to 1981 wanted to sue the Iranian government for damages. Part of the Algiers agreement, which freed those hostages, said that they could not be sued, the Iranians couldn't be sued, and so the U.S. government, through the State Department, filed amicus briefs in support of the Iranian government, arguing that basically if we allowed Iran to be sued, then that would invalidate any future U.S. agreements, that the U.S. couldn't be trusted as a treaty partner, and it would lower U.S. credibility abroad. So there'd been a variety of ways to try to engage the Iranians and support the Iranians, to be sure. But again, there was at least some measure of access. I'm not suggesting that it was great. I'm not suggesting that there weren't flaws in the deal. And Will is correct to point out the strategic contradiction within it, which is the hope being that the regime will fall at some point in the not too distant future, but the allocation of resources. I would argue back against that, though, that there's also a counterpoint, which is that we're holding the Iranian people in some sense to a standard, i.e., why aren't you rising up and overthrowing your government, that we don't necessarily hold a lot of other entities or populations to, and that creates a challenge in and of itself as well. So the deal wasn't, I'm not going to suggest that it was enormously positive, but faced with what were the alternatives on the table and why do we want to try to do anything here, that creates an issue. This also is the space where I think we could go back to that question about, do we recognize the Taliban? The United States did not recognize the Iranian government for years, formally, but even just a few years after the hostage crisis, the overthrow, the fall of the Shah, the taking of the American embassy, was selling weapons illegally to it and has engaged in other episodes with the Iranian government over time. That is why I say, with the Taliban, we might be a little smarter to openly engage with it rather than trying to do some of the other stuff behind the scenes. Now, I could be wrong on that, right? And that's part of studying policy. And Will has both the advantage and the disadvantage of having been a policymaker. I've just been a scholar. It's easy for me to snipe from the sidelines. In a lot of cases, Will's actually had to make some tough decisions. And that's one thing that we also have to recognize. Rarely is doing nothing an actual viable policy option. Usually, the options that you have in front of you, none of them are perfect. Right? So it's trying to think through a series of bad options. I would argue the Iran deal was a better option than some of the other options that were on the table at the time.
Dr. Inboden, drawing on maybe your experience as a policymaker, do you want to respond to that?
No, I mean, good points by Matt. I laid mine out, but I know you've got a couple other things to cover. I'm just mindful of time. So.
Absolutely. So Dr. Jacobs just kind of broadened the question, talking about why countries might want to have nuclear weapons overall. A report came out recently that China has sharply expanded its nuclear arsenal. So I'm curious, how should we understand the U.S. relationship with China? Are they a partner, a rival? How should we view this strengthened nuclear arsenal, especially in light of tensions in the South China Sea? Professor Inboden?
Yes, China's growing nuclear arsenal is a concern, but it's frankly not the biggest concern with China. It's one of many. I do think China is the biggest threat the United States faces, both in the medium and longer term. And the biggest challenge we face. To give a little bit of context here, and this is where an example of where my thinking and views have changed or evolved quite a bit over time. I would argue in some ways in response to events. But again, a brief digression into history and also some of my policy history. In the 1990s, shortly after the collapse of Soviet communism, the freeing of Central and Eastern Europe, and less appreciated, some remarkable democratic transitions in East Asia as military dictatorships in South Korea, Taiwan, and Philippines all underwent peaceful democratic changes. There was real hope in the United States, a hope I shared as a very young policymaker working on Capitol Hill, that China would also undergo a peaceful democratic transition from one-party rule by the Chinese Communist Party to some sort of pluralism. We had seen the vibrancy and courage of the democracy movement in China at Tiananmen Square in June of 1989, and also seen them horribly massacred, butchered by the People's Liberation Army as the CCP was so desperate to maintain its monopoly on power. But Tiananmen, in a lot of ways, as awful as it was a sign of weakness in the regime. Like this is not a strong, confident regime if it has to massacre innocent students who are otherwise the cream of the crop, the great hope for the future of that country. And so what was the strategic framework the United States adopted? It was this engagement one. It was, let's treat China like a friend. Let's welcome them into the World Trade Organization. Let's build deep economic and cultural and political ties. Let's treat them with respect like a rising superpower. And let's encourage them to liberalize their economy. And the hope was that as China would become richer and more integrated into the international economy, it would also liberalize politically and become a more responsible stakeholder, as Deputy Secretary of State Bob Zoellick famously put it in a speech. And I think, again, going back to my point about historical empathy, judging policymakers by what the world looked like at the time, what the available options seemed to be, that was not an absurd position to hold, right? Every one of those assumptions behind that, I think, were rational. They were grounded in recent history. They were grounded in what we were seeing with the political transformations of East Asia, as well as the peaceful transitions and fall of communism in Central and Eastern Europe. But that policy, that strategy was also completely wrong. And we are dealing with the after effects, the bitter fruits of that now. And I don't just say this as an analytic matter. When I was a congressional staffer, I was one of several who was working to help pass the legislation so that China could join the WTO. Because I believed this. I thought, okay, this engagement, this treating them as friends, the web of multilateral commitments and obligations that it will have will bring about eventually a peaceful democratic transition. Well, what happened? Part of it worked. China did become a lot more rich. So that part worked, okay? But if anything, the CCP became also much more aggressive, much more aggressive internationally, much more repressive of its people at home, much more desperate to continue clinging to power, and has now dedicated itself to expanding its influence in the world at the expense of the United States and our allies in ways that are very inimical to our interests. And so we are now dealing with a foreign policy challenge that I think in these terms is quite literally unprecedented in human history. Here's where I'll kind of be the big picture historian here. Never before in human history have you had two entities, two empires or two nation states in this case, whose economies are so deeply intertwined and interdependent on each other, who are also becoming strategic rivals and adversaries, right? We've never had that equation before. And it's really, really difficult, and it's very, very dangerous. And that challenge is the one I'm bequeathing to all the young people here. That is the challenge of your generation. We'll get through Russia, Ukraine, we'll get through some of these other Middle East ones. I'm not downplaying those at all. But this China challenge will be with us for, I think, at least the next half century. And it's very dangerous, and it's very difficult. And that's what caused me to lose my hair.
I wish I could point to a specific thing that caused me to lose my hair.
There was a few other things too. Okay, yeah.
But anyway, so the question of is China a threat or they a partner? The answer is both, but in some different ways. I think Will's recounting of the perception of the glory days of the 1990s, I think, is a fair rendering of what U.S. policymakers and a lot of not just policymakers, but people more broadly have thought or were thinking at the time. In my class, I showed them the Scorpions playing Winds of Change and Jesus Jones right here, right now. And I showed them a video of Tank Man. If you're not familiar with Tank Man, go on YouTube and pull up the clip. The morning after the clearing of Tiananmen Square, there's a column of tanks, Chinese People's Liberation Army tanks, going down a main thoroughfare in Beijing, and one man walking back from a grocery store steps in front of the front tank, and it's all caught on camera. And he's waving his arms with his grocery bag, telling them to get out of his city. And for things that still remain, a reason that remain unclear to me, the whole, it's one guy, he can't stop, the column is 20 tanks, he can't stop all 20 tanks. The others don't break formation and go around him or anything. They all stop right in line, and he climbs up on the tank and is yelling at the people to get out of his city and stuff. And so we were all kind of captured in that moment. In 1989, when Tiananmen happened, June of 89, I was a senior in high school, so I've just aged myself appropriately for all of you. So we were all captured by that, right? And we did all hope that that would be the case. Looking back, there are a couple things to think about. Why might that have been wrong beyond some of the things that Will was talking about? One reason why it might have been wrong is it assumes all people on earth are the same, that we're all driven by the same motivations, that we all read things exactly the same. For example, one of the things that you might know a little bit now is China's social credit system, whereby like if Luca and I, if I have a mortgage and I don't pay my bill, my mortgage payment, Luca, because he knows me, suddenly gets demerits in his social credit system and he can't apply for a mortgage, right? Now we look at that and we're like, oh my gosh, that's horrible. Why is Luca responsible? Because I'm derelict in my mortgage payments. Fortunately, I'm not, so Luca, you're okay. But the point there is that social credit system in China, while it has caused some tensions, hasn't actually engendered a lot of resistance to it. People are kind of like, okay, this is a new thing we have to adapt to, but it hasn't engendered the same sort of response that we would expect it to have here, right? So not everybody views things exactly the same way. The second thing that we might have thought a little bit more about at the time, and this would also connect with Russia and Ukraine, is that the victory story, the triumphalist vision that Americans felt after the end of the Cold War wasn't the same story for everyone else. If you were in the former Soviet Union, and there was a lot of public opinion polling on this in around 1994 and 1995, whereby a lot of folks actually said, not that they preferred the Stalin era, but they would have gone back to that. Why? Because it was predictable. There might have only been one type of bread, but there was bread. The predictability, they knew what would get them in trouble, they knew what they could survive, how they could survive. And in no way am I glorifying the Stalin era, trust me. But the point is that then for them in that moment, the uncertainty, the fear of the unknown was really problematic, right? And I would argue that not just US policymakers, but Americans more broadly did little to try to understand outside of our own triumphalist vision what that moment might look like for others in different positions and experiencing that from the other side of that perspective, right? To get back to the question of China then, when we think about that, yes, our economies are more integrated, and not just our economies with each other, but our economies, meaning the United States and China, with the world around us than they were then. Just today, I was showing in class manufacturing data. The United States is responsible for 17% of the world's manufacturing. China is responsible for about 28% about 22 or 23% of the world's manufacturing. It's 28% of the Chinese economy. It's about 12% of the U.S. economy, which tells you something right there, too, when you think about the level of integration. That creates real challenges, right? And then as China is trying to assert its primacy, not just in the South China Sea, but also through other initiatives in other areas, through Belt and Road and other opportunities. You're looking at the contracts that they signed with some African countries to build railroads, for example, in labor usage there, where they said they'll employ local labor, but then they bring in Chinese laborers to do the work in violation of those contracts. Those are real problems that are going to be difficult to solve. So I don't minimize that. But I think that a little more humility on the part of Americans several years ago, and thus I think a little more humility on the part of Americans at this point in time, thinking through not just the China problem, but a bunch of other problems, might also be beneficial in some ways to try to think through what's the other partner in this relationship thinking at a given moment in time. Last point I'll make is Xi Jinping, Jiang Zemin being the prior leader, has very much tried to rebuild, if you will, that sense of Chinese power, right? And rebuild the power of the Chinese Communist Party and really clamp down on that. The defense minister, there's just a story out today that the Chinese defense minister, who hasn't been seen in 2 months, has now been formally removed from power as well. And so that's, again, and that's hard, right? There's no easy answer there.
Luca, can I chime in? Just reacting to one thing that Matt said. And Matt, you're right about the general, I think, compliance with the social credit system thus far. And I don't think you were saying this, but I just want to be clear. Don't mistake the lack of a vibrant, active, upswelling and call for democracy among the Chinese people for a belief that the Chinese people are incapable of self-government or that they don't desire more freedom, right? We don't really know. We know that Xi Jinping tells us the Chinese people are not ready for self-government. That's why they need to be controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, and that's why we can't risk allowing free and fair elections. We know that China invests billions, hundreds of billions of dollars a year in the most extensive, intrusive, truly Orwellian surveillance state in human history to control what its people think and say and know what they're know what they're believing. So that doesn't show me a sign of a government that is confident or trusts its people. But also we should be a little wary of judging the Chinese people too much for not uprising for more self-government, given that they have very few options. Chinese Communist Party repression has been devilishly effective, I fear, right? They have decapitated what had been several generations of democracy movement going back to Tiananmen Square. They've all either been executed or imprisoned or exiled. Hundreds of thousands of democracy activists and other dissenters against the Chinese Communist Party. So in that sense, the repression has been effective, but let's not mistake that for thinking that the Chinese people are incapable of democracy. Final point on this: why is Xi Jinping so obsessed with Taiwan? This kind of small island of only 22 million people off their coast, which historically China has had some control over, but then Japan did and had some autonomy. Why is he obsessed with that? Because it's 22 million people, primarily ethnic Chinese, primarily Mandarin speakers, who are a vibrant, thriving democracy. And every day that Taiwan continues as a vibrant, thriving democracy is a pretty emphatic rebuttal to Xi Jinping's argument that the Chinese people are incapable of democracy. So don't buy it when he says that. And this is one of many reasons why the United States should support Taiwan.
All right, we are running up against time here. I want to remind everyone in the audience that there is a reception afterward and that this is an opportunity to engage with our speakers further. I know both Dr. Inboden and Dr. Jacobs are looking forward to answering questions and are more than willing to explain their perspectives further. I want to close with this last question, just if you'd like to say briefly, and then perhaps people could ask you more at the reception. In each of your opinion, what is the biggest foreign policy challenge facing the U.S. today?
So obviously China is one of them, and I wouldn't argue against that. I would also like us to think a little bit, though, about some other types of challenges that require more collaboration across multiple states to try to solve. So here I'm thinking about something like climate change. I'm thinking about public health, global health issues that require They don't have the flair of a potential conflagration in the immediate term, but long term are real serious challenges that require close collaboration across very different states with very different approaches to government, very different approaches to leadership within their own states. And so I think that's some of those types of issues are going to be really challenging if we want to make real progress on them. I'm not minimizing the importance of something like China and individual state-to-state relations. As I said earlier, none of these have easy solutions. If they were solved easily, we wouldn't be talking about them. We didn't even get to one of the questions on Ukraine and Russia, where my response to that would be, what does victory look like? There's no identification of what victory actually looks like in that conflict. So I'll stop there. And thank you, everyone, for attending, and thanks to Luca and Will for participating.
Absolutely. Dr. Inboden?
Yeah, I'll just continue just one or two final thoughts. Obviously, I've said earlier, I think China is the biggest challenge. And I'll put the challenge this way, is how the United States can prevent China from achieving its goal of being the dominant hegemon in the international system, sort of rewriting the rules of the world according to Beijing's preferences. How can we stop them from doing that while avoiding a hot war? And that's a very, very difficult question. That's going to involve certainly stepped up military capabilities and deterrence against Chinese aggression. It's going to involve, I think, an accelerated decoupling of our economies, going back to that puzzle I stated earlier. It's going to involve redoubled diplomacy and economic engagement with a lot of the rest of the world, which is now where the United States and China are competing for influence. And I do think it will involve bringing more pressure to bear internally on the Chinese Communist Party by supporting those few courageous Chinese voices who do want human rights and want more freedom in their lives and are feeling right now very alone, abandoned, beleaguered by the United States and others.
All right, that's going to close out the formally moderated portion of today's discussion. Thank you all for coming, and be sure to enjoy the food afterward. Can we get a big hand for our speakers?
Thank you.
And for Luca. Thanks, Luca. I think the food's back there, so we'll be down there in a minute.
Luca, really well done.